The pattern appeared across continents. In Chicago, in Paris, in Melbourne, in St. Petersburg, wherever 19th century photographs survived, the same anomaly recurred. Doorways scaled for 12-foot people, ceilings that soared to 18, 20, 22 feet in ordinary public buildings, staircases with treads too deep, as if designed for longer strides. I found believers measuring these spaces in dozens of countries, comparing photographs, mapping the proportions of a world that no longer builds this way. They had reached the same conclusion independently. These buildings weren't built for us. The photographs weren't lying. The measurements were accurate. The difference between then and now was undeniably real. But somewhere between observation and explanation, something had gone wrong, and I needed to understand what. I was looking at photographs of buildings that no longer exist when I first encountered the believers. It started with the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago, what they called the White City. I'd been researching Victorian-era World's Fair architecture for a project on temporary structures, the kind of mundane academic work that involves measuring doorways in old photographs and cross-referencing construction timelines. The Court of Honor, the Manufacturers Building, the soaring facades that drew 27 million visitors to see what American ambition could produce. The photographs still hold power, even knowing the buildings were made of staff, a mixture of plaster and fiber stretched over wood frames, designed to be demolished within months of the fair's closing. Something about the scale commands attention. Doorways that dwarf the crowds passing through them. Ceiling heights that made the grand exhibition halls feel like cathedrals. The proportions of a civilization that wanted to announce itself to the world. I was deep in the comment sections of an architectural history forum when I first saw the claim. Someone had posted a high-resolution scan of the agriculture building, and beneath it, a response that stopped me mid-scroll. These weren't built by Victorians. They were inherited, found, repurposed after the giants were erased. My first reaction was dismissal. Obviously, the construction records exist. The architects are documented: Daniel Burnham, Frederick Law Olmsted, Charles McKim. The buildings were demolished on schedule, most of them torn down by 1894. This was fringe internet noise, the kind of thing you scroll past without a second thought. But then, I made a mistake. I clicked through to the commenter's profile, and from there to the subreddit they frequented, and from there to the YouTube videos they had linked. And within an hour, I had fallen into something I didn't expect. Not dozens of believers, thousands, tens of thousands. Comment sections with hundreds of people agreeing, sharing photographs, building elaborate theories that connected buildings across continents. And these weren't ranting conspiracy theorists typing in all capitals. Many of them sounded measured. They cited sources, architectural surveys, old newspaper articles, museum catalog entries. They asked questions that, on the surface, seemed almost reasonable. They described their own process of investigation with the same methodical language I use in my own research. The theory had a name, Tartaria, and a central claim that a global civilization of giants once built the magnificent structures we now attribute to our ancestors, and that this history was systematically erased sometime in the 19th or early 20th century. The evidence, according to believers, was everywhere. In the oversized doorways of old courthouses, in the anomalous ceiling heights of Victorian homes, in photographs of skeleton excavations that mainstream archaeology refuses to acknowledge. I spent 3 days reading their forums, watching their videos, following their chains of evidence. And by the end of those 3 days, I realized something that changed the direction of my research entirely. The mystery wasn't the giants. The mystery was the belief. What makes this particular theory so compelling to so many people? Why does it spread faster than debunking can contain it? Why do intelligent, functioning adults stake their reputations on claims that seem, from the outside, so obviously false? Those are real questions. They have real answers, And I started to suspect that finding those answers might reveal something uncomfortable. Not about hidden history, but about how we relate to the past, to institutions, to the physical spaces we move through every day without really seeing. I stopped trying to disprove the theory. Instead, I started trying to understand the believers. And that's when things got strange. The photographs are the entry point. Every Tartarian believer I encountered had their own collection, saved to phones, organized in folders, shared across platforms with the reverence of sacred texts, giant skeleton excavations, impossibly tall doorways in ordinary buildings, oversized furniture in museum storage. The images circulate through the community like currency, each one offered as proof that something is being hidden. I started cataloging them, not to debunk, at least not yet, but to understand what believers see when they look at these photographs. What makes them feel like evidence? The skeleton images are the most dramatic. Men in 19th century clothing standing beside excavation pits, looking down at bones that appear to dwarf human scale. Femurs the length of a man's torso. Skulls that could fit a basketball inside. The photographs have the sepia tones and formal composition of the era, the kind of images you'd expect to find in a historical society's archive. I examined several of the most commonly shared examples, checked the grain patterns, analyzed the lighting, looked for the telltale signs of manipulation, inconsistent shadows, repeated textures, the artifacts that Photoshop leaves behind. And here's what I found, which complicated my initial dismissal. Some of these images are obvious fakes. Digital composites created for Photoshop contests, which I'll discuss later. But others predate digital manipulation entirely. The photographs themselves appear authentic to their era. The printing techniques match. The paper stock is consistent. The exposure patterns align with 19th century equipment. The question isn't whether the photographs are old. Many of them are. The question is what they actually depict. And that's where human perception becomes unreliable in ways that have nothing to do with conspiracy. I spent a week reading research on scale perception in photographs. What I found was humbling. Humans are remarkably bad at judging size in images without clear reference points. A doorway photographed from below appears taller than the same doorway photographed at eye level. A skeleton photographed next to a crouching figure appears larger than if the figure were standing. A wide-angle lens can make a 14-foot ceiling look like 20 feet. A narrow lens can compress a grand hall into something ordinary. These aren't tricks in the malicious sense. They're how vision works. The camera captures a two-dimensional slice of a three-dimensional world, and our brains fill in the missing information based on assumptions that may or may not be correct. When we see what appears to be a person standing next to what appears to be a skeleton, we assume the person is of average height, if they're crouching or standing further back, or if the camera angle distorts the relative proportions, the skeleton appears enormous. But here's what made me pause. Telling believers that the photos involve tricks of perspective doesn't work, because in many cases, the believers aren't wrong about what they're seeing. The buildings in these photographs really were built with soaring ceilings and massive doorways. The furniture in museum collections really is scaled larger than modern equivalents. The architectural proportions of the 19th century genuinely feel different from what we build today. The believer's instinct, something is different here, is correct. What's wrong is the explanation, not the observation. I measured my own doorways, 6 feet, 8 inches, standard for modern American construction. Then I looked at photographs of Victorian interiors, parlors, hallways, entrance foyers. The doorways in those images consistently measured 10, 11, sometimes 12 feet or more. The ceilings rose to 14, 16, 18 feet in ordinary middle-class homes, not just in mansions or public buildings. This difference is real. It's measurable. It's documented in construction records and architectural surveys. The question is what it means. For believers, it means giants. For architectural historians, it means different cultural values and different engineering constraints. But I was beginning to understand why the historical explanation, however accurate, doesn't satisfy the emotional need that the giant hypothesis serves. Once someone accepts the framework that giants built these structures, every image becomes confirming evidence. This isn't stupidity. It's not gullibility. It's how human cognition actually works. The brain is a pattern completion machine. It takes fragments of information and builds coherent narratives that explain them. This mechanism helped our ancestors survive. The rustle in the grass might be a predator, and the cost of assuming pattern, where none exists, is lower than the cost of missing a real threat. The same mechanism that kept humans alive on the savannah now builds elaborate alternative histories on Reddit. And telling someone their pattern is wrong doesn't make the pattern-seeking stop. It just makes them look for more evidence to complete the pattern they've already started to see. I watched it happen in real time. A believer would post a photograph of an old building with tall doorways. Someone would respond with architectural context, heat management, natural lighting, status signaling. The believer wouldn't argue. They would simply post another photograph, and another, and another. The volume of images overwhelmed the explanations. Each image that the skeptic couldn't immediately account for became another data point confirming the pattern. And I started to realize that arguing about photograph authenticity was missing the point entirely. Then I started asking a different question. Not, are the photographs real? But why is the cover-up claim so easy to believe? Tartarian believers don't just think giants existed. They think institutions, museums, universities, governments, the entire apparatus of official knowledge, actively suppress the evidence. The Smithsonian confiscates giant skeletons. Archaeologists bury findings. Historians lie. The mainstream consensus isn't just wrong, it's complicit. My instinct was to dismiss this as paranoia, but the deeper I went into the believer communities, the more I encountered something I hadn't expected. References to real events, real cover-ups, real instances where institutions had suppressed inconvenient truths. They talked about the systematic erasure of indigenous histories from American education. Generations of students taught that the continent was empty wilderness before European arrival, while the evidence of complex civilizations was filed away in museum basements. They talked about urban renewal projects that demolished black neighborhoods and conveniently lost the records. They talked about tobacco companies suppressing cancer research, lead paint manufacturers funding studies that downplayed poisoning risks, oil companies burying climate data for decades. They talked about Tuskegee, COINTELPRO, the Gulf of Tonkin, Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. They assembled timelines of admitted government lies, instances where the official story was later revealed to be false, where conspiracy theorists turned out to be right, where trusting the experts led people astray. I found myself in an uncomfortable position. I wasn't ready to believe in giants, but I couldn't dismiss the emotional logic that led people to distrust institutions. Because the emotional logic was built on a foundation of actual historical examples. One name kept appearing in the believer forums, the Smithsonian. In Tartarian lore, the Smithsonian Institution functions as the primary villain, the entity responsible for confiscating giant skeleton evidence, destroying what couldn't be hidden, and maintaining the cover-up across generations. The claim seemed absurd at first. A national museum engaged in systematic suppression of archaeological evidence. But then, I started reading about the Smithsonian's actual history. The repatriation disputes with indigenous nations over human remains, held in collections without consent. The documented instances of collection mismanagement, artifacts lost, mislabeled, or stored in conditions that led to deterioration. The historical biases that shaped what was considered worthy of study and what was dismissed. I'm not suggesting the Smithsonian is hiding giant skeletons. I found no evidence of that. But I began to understand how the institution could become a plausible villain in a conspiracy narrative. When trust is broken in one area, it becomes easier to believe it's broken in others. The specific claim about giants might be false. The underlying premise, that powerful institutions sometimes hide inconvenient truths, is demonstrably accurate. Many believers described the same experience to me. They had asked questions about something. They had been told to trust the experts. And later, they discovered the experts were wrong or lying about something else entirely. The emotional conclusion was almost inevitable. If they lied about X, why should I believe them about Y? I kept testing this pattern. I would find a believer making confident claims about giant cover-ups and search their post history for what else they discussed. Over and over, I found the same trajectory. They had started with a legitimate grievance, a medical misdiagnosis, a financial institution that defrauded them, a government program that failed as promised. The distrust began somewhere real. It metastasized into everything. The giant theory didn't create the distrust. It gave the distrust a shape, a story, a community of fellow travelers who had reached the same conclusion. Institutions have earned distrust. Not about giants, but about enough other things that blanket credibility is gone for many people. The theory succeeds partly because its underlying emotional premise is sometimes accurate. And that realization made me deeply uncomfortable. Because if I'm honest, I don't know how you rebuild trust once it's broken at this scale. I don't know what evidence would be sufficient to convince someone that this particular institution, on this particular question, is telling the truth, when that same institution, or ones like it, have demonstrably lied before. I couldn't argue believers out of their distrust. I could only document it. And then I started tracing how the theory actually spread. Tartarian theory didn't emerge from suppressed ancient texts or forbidden archaeology. It crystallized on Reddit and YouTube, primarily between 2016 and 2018. I tracked down what appeared to be some of the earliest posts, scattered speculations about old buildings that coalesced, over months, into a unified theory with its own vocabulary and evidentiary standards. The timeline mattered. This was the era when algorithmic content recommendation was becoming sophisticated enough to create self-reinforcing bubbles. YouTube's recommendation engine, in particular, had begun optimizing for watch time above all other metrics. And conspiracy content, it turned out, generated extraordinary watch time. Viewers didn't just watch one video. They watched chains of videos, each one leading to the next, each one deeper into the theory. I tested this myself. I created a fresh browser profile with no search history and watched a single video about old architecture. Something mainstream, nothing conspiratorial. Within 3 recommendations, the algorithm offered me a Tartarian theory video. I clicked it. The next recommendation was another, and another. Within 2 hours, my entire recommended feed assumed that giants were real and that I wanted to learn more. The algorithm doesn't care about truth. It cares about engagement. And the Tartarian theory engages. It has the narrative structure of a mystery, clues to uncover, patterns to recognize, secrets to reveal. Every video ends with an implicit promise. There's more to discover. The viewer who clicks through is rewarded with a sense of progressive revelation, of penetrating deeper into hidden knowledge. I started mapping the community dynamics. The believers weren't isolated individuals shouting into voids. They had built elaborate social structures with their own norms, vocabulary, and reward systems. Doing your own research functioned as a status marker. The believers, who had spent the most hours examining photographs, cross-referencing maps, and compiling evidence, earned respect. Their posts were upvoted. Their videos were shared. Their interpretations became reference points for newcomers. Questioning the theory, on the other hand, was framed not as legitimate skepticism, but as a failure of perception. You're not ready to see it yet. Your programming is too strong. Keep looking. Eventually you'll understand. The community had developed antibodies against doubt. Skeptics weren't engaged. They were pitied. And sharing new evidence, a photograph that hadn't been widely circulated, a newspaper article from an obscure archive, a measurement that didn't fit official explanations, earned immediate recognition. The finder was celebrated. The evidence was incorporated into the canon. The community grew through contribution. I recognized the pattern. I'd seen it in academic communities, in hobbyist forums, in religious groups. The specific content differed, but the social mechanics were identical. Belonging, purpose, shared identity. The feeling of being part of something larger than yourself, of having access to knowledge that outsiders lack. The theory wasn't just an explanation for tall doorways. It was a community. And arguing about photograph authenticity did nothing to address the social needs that community membership fulfilled. Then, I noticed something that disturbed me more than the photographs or the institutional distrust or the algorithmic amplification. The theory had evolved to become immune to disproof. Every piece of counter-evidence had been incorporated into the conspiracy narrative. Documented construction records for the buildings in question, fabricated after the fact. Architects' journals describing the design process, plants, inserted into archives to support the cover story. Photographs showing buildings under construction, with workers and scaffolding and partially completed frames. Staged. Photographs of the buildings being demolished, also staged, to create the illusion that they were temporary when they were actually permanent structures being destroyed to hide their true origins. I tested this with a believer who seemed particularly thoughtful. I presented what I considered the most straightforward evidence against the theory. Construction photographs of the 1893 exposition showing the wooden frames being erected, the staff facades being applied, the temporary infrastructure that made the buildings possible. Their response was immediate. Those photographs could have been taken anywhere. There's no proof they're actually the White City. And even if they are, they could be showing the covering-up process, adding fake framework to buildings that already existed to make them look newly built. I had no counter-argument that wouldn't be absorbed by the same logic. If fabrication is possible, any evidence can be fabricated. If staging is possible, any photograph can be staged. The theory had developed an immune system that turned every attack into confirmation. And the believers weren't stupid. They were applying the same skepticism that critical thinking courses teach. Question sources. Consider alternative explanations. Don't accept official narratives at face value. They had simply aimed that skepticism in a direction that led away from, rather than toward, verifiable truth. I kept asking why. Why this theory specifically? Why did it catch and spread when countless other fringe ideas remained obscure? The algorithmic amplification explained the mechanism of spread, but not the initial appeal. The community dynamics explained why people stayed, but not why they arrived in the first place. The answer, I began to suspect, had something to do with what people had invested before they ever found the community. The believers I spoke with had often spent months, sometimes years, assembling their own evidence before connecting with others. They had measured buildings in their cities. They had photographed doorways and staircases. They had compiled folders of images and timelines of erasure. By the time they found the Tartarian community, they had already built an identity around the theory. They had argued with friends and family who thought they were crazy. They had been dismissed, mocked, told they were seeing patterns that weren't there. The community didn't create their belief. It validated belief they had already developed in isolation. And at that point, what would it cost to admit the theory was wrong? Not just the intellectual acknowledgement of error, but the social consequences. The relationship strained by arguments about giants. The time invested in research that would become worthless. The identity built around being someone who sees what others can't. The psychology of belief perseverance is well documented. Humans are remarkably resistant to changing beliefs that are central to their identity. especially when changing would mean admitting that significant effort was wasted. The believers weren't persisting, despite the evidence against them. They were persisting because the cost of updating was higher than the cost of continuing. And that's when I realized I needed to understand what the theory was actually offering. What emotional need it met that would make the cost of belief lower than the cost of disbelief. But first, I had to trace where the evidence actually came from. The giant skeleton photographs were the obvious starting point. They circulated more widely than any other evidence, appeared in more arguments, inspired more converts. If the theory had a visual vocabulary, these images were its alphabet. I selected 4 of the most commonly cited examples and set about tracing each to its actual origin. Not to triumphantly debunk. I had learned that debunking alone changed nothing, but to understand the archaeology of the hoax itself. Where did these images come from? How did they enter circulation? And why did they persist when their origins were knowable? The first photograph showed 2 men in early 20th century clothing standing at the edge of an excavation pit, gazing down at a skeleton that appeared to be at least 10 feet long. The image had the tonal qualities of the period, the formal poses, the slightly overexposed sky that suggested authentic daylight photography. The source was a Photoshop contest. In 2004, a website called Worth 1000 hosted a competition challenging digital artists to create convincing images of archaeological discoveries. The giant skeleton photograph was an entry, created by a graphic designer whose name is still attached to the original file in the site's archives. The artist had composited period-appropriate figures with digitally enlarged skeletal remains, applied filters to simulate aging, and produced an image compelling enough to win recognition in the contest. Within months, the image had escaped its context. It appeared on paranormal forums without attribution. It was shared on early social media, with claims that it depicted a real discovery, suppressed by mainstream science. By the time I encountered it in Tartarian communities 20 years later, the image had been compressed, recompressed, screenshot, and re-uploaded so many times that its digital origin was no longer visible in the artifacting. It looked old. It felt authentic. And the believers who shared it had no idea it was created as entertainment. The second photograph had a more complicated provenance. It appeared to show a group of men excavating an enormous skull, far larger than any human cranium. Unlike the first image, this one actually was old. The printing technique dated it to the late 19th century. But the photograph didn't depict a giant. It depicted a mastodon. The skull was real. The excavation was real. The photograph documented a legitimate paleontological discovery from the 1880s. But somewhere in the century since, the context had been stripped away. The image circulated without caption, without identification, without any indication of what species the skull belonged to. To eyes unfamiliar with megafauna anatomy, it looked human. To eyes primed by the giant hypothesis, it confirmed everything. I found 3 other giant skeleton photographs that followed the same pattern. Genuine images of mammoth or mastodon excavations, misidentified through ignorance or deliberate mislabeling, circulating as evidence of human giants. The bones were real. The photographs were real. Only the interpretation was false. The third image I traced had yet another origin: 19th century newspaper hoaxes. The Cardiff Giant, a 10-foot petrified man displayed in New York in 1869, was one of the most famous frauds in American history. It was eventually revealed to be a carved gypsum statue, commissioned by a tobacco farmer to settle an argument about biblical giants. But before the exposure, the giant drew enormous crowds and spawned a cottage industry of imitators. Newspapers of the era gleefully published photographs and illustrations of giant discoveries, many of them transparently promotional, some of them satirical, most of them forgotten within months of publication. But the images survived. They were reprinted in books about curiosities. They were collected by enthusiasts. They migrated onto the internet without the contextual winking that would have made their hoax nature obvious to contemporary audiences. The believers had built an evidentiary case on foundations of Photoshop contests, misidentified megafauna, and 19th century carnival promotions. And when I presented this information to them, they had already heard it. They had incorporated it into their framework. Of course, the mainstream claims they're fake. That's exactly what a cover-up would produce. The debunking had become evidence of the conspiracy. The more thoroughly the photographs were traced to mundane origins, the more sophisticated the cover-up appeared to be. I had proven the images weren't evidence of giants. I had proven nothing at all to the people who needed them to be real. And that's when I finally started asking the right question. If the photos are fake, if the bones are misidentified, if the buildings have documented mundane origins, why do people need giants to be real? What hole does this theory fill? What are believers actually seeking when they seek evidence of a lost civilization of enormous beings? The photographs aren't really evidence in the scientific sense. They're totems. They're shared symbols that mark community membership, that distinguish believers from skeptics, that create a sense of special knowledge in a world where knowledge feels increasingly inaccessible to ordinary people. Attacking the photographs feels like attacking the community itself, not because the community was built on the photographs, but because the photographs are what the community holds in common. I had spent weeks investigating the mechanics of the theory, the images, the distrust, the algorithms, the community dynamics, the hoax archaeology. Each piece fit with the others. Each piece explained part of the pattern. But I still hadn't answered the fundamental question. Why this theory? Why giants specifically? Why doorways built for 12-foot people, rather than any of the countless other alternative histories that circulate online without catching fire in the same way? The answer, I was beginning to suspect, had something to do with the doorways themselves, with the buildings, with the physical experience of moving through spaces that feel different from the spaces we build today. And to understand that, I had to stop looking at photographs and start measuring buildings. I started with the building I knew best, my own house, constructed in 1952, a modest post-war suburban home of the type that proliferated across America in the decades after World War II. I measured every doorway, 6 feet 8 inches, consistently throughout the house. The ceilings were 8 feet on the main floor, 7 feet in the basement. The windows were sized for efficiency, not grandeur. The proportions were human-scaled in a way that felt unremarkable because I had lived with them my entire life. Then, I drove to the county courthouse, built in 1887. I brought a tape measure and a notebook, and I spent an afternoon doing something I had never thought to do. I measured. The main entrance doors were 11 feet 4 inches tall. The interior doorways ranged from 9 to 10 feet. The ceilings in the public areas soared to 16 feet, and in the main courtroom to 22. The windows stretched nearly floor to ceiling, admitting light that my suburban windows could never match. The staircases had risers of 8 inches, comfortable for modern feet, but the treads were deeper than I was used to, as if designed for a longer stride. I stood in the center of the rotunda and looked up. The space felt different. Not just larger, but different in kind. The air moved differently. Sound behaved differently. My own body felt different. Smaller, perhaps, but also somehow elevated, as if the architecture was designed to make the humans within it feel the weight of something greater than themselves. The believers weren't imagining the difference. The difference was real. I spent the following weeks measuring other buildings from the same era. Banks, churches, train stations, private homes that had survived urban renewal. The pattern held. Ceiling heights of 14 to 18 feet in spaces that modern construction would compress to 8 or 9. Doorways scaled for drama rather than efficiency. Windows that prioritized light over insulation. Staircases that rose gradually, with landings and turns that modern buildings eliminate to save space. The question was never whether 19th century buildings were built differently. They were. The question was why. I found the answers in architectural history texts, in engineering manuals from the period, in the practical concerns that shaped construction before air conditioning, before electric lighting, before central heating became universal. Heat management was the most significant factor. In an era before mechanical cooling, ceiling height was the primary tool for making interior spaces bearable in summer. Hot air rises. In a room with 8-foot ceilings, the hot air has nowhere to go. It accumulates at head height, making the space feel stifling. In a room with 16-foot ceilings, the hot air rises above the occupied zone, and the space below remains relatively comfortable. The same principle applied to public buildings, where large crowds generated significant body heat. The soaring ceilings of Victorian courthouses and train stations weren't aesthetic indulgences. They were engineering solutions to thermal problems that modern HVAC systems have made invisible. Lighting followed similar logic. Before electric illumination became widespread in the early 20th century, natural light was the primary source of interior visibility. Taller windows admitted more light, and higher ceilings allowed that light to penetrate deeper into rooms. The proportions that seem excessive to modern eyes were calibrated for a world where the alternative to tall windows was working by candlelight or oil lamp. Ventilation mattered too. Before forced air systems, buildings relied on natural convection to move air through interior spaces. Higher ceilings created vertical air columns that drew fresh air in through lower openings and exhausted stale air through upper vents or open windows. The architecture wasn't just containing space, it was shaping airflow. And then there was status. Vertical space was cheaper than horizontal space, easier to build upward than to expand a footprint. And grandeur mattered socially in ways that efficiency culture has since eroded. A tall ceiling announced prosperity. A grand doorway signaled importance. The architecture was performing for visitors, communicating messages about the inhabitant's place in the social order. These explanations are correct. They're documented. They're verifiable through construction records, architectural treatises, and the physical evidence of the buildings themselves. I have no reason to doubt them, and yet, I found myself standing in that courthouse rotunda, knowing the technical explanations, and still feeling something the explanations didn't capture. The building made me feel small in a way my suburban house never did. It made me feel like I was in the presence of something that took itself seriously, that expected to endure, that was built by people who believed their work mattered beyond the immediate moment. My house was built to be adequate. The courthouse was built to be magnificent. And I started to understand, finally, why the correct explanations fail to satisfy the believers emotionally. The technical answers are mundane. They reduce magnificent spaces to engineering problems. They translate grandeur into thermal dynamics and lighting calculations. They strip the wonder from buildings that were clearly designed to inspire wonder. The giant hypothesis does the opposite. It makes the buildings magical again. It transforms engineering solutions into evidence of a lost civilization, a forgotten race, a history that the powerful don't want you to know. The buildings become monuments to something greater than heat management. They become proof that the world was once more extraordinary than we've been told. Which story would you rather believe? I asked this question to several believers, framing it as curiosity rather than challenge. Their answers were remarkably consistent. They didn't reject the technical explanations outright. Many of them knew about heat management and natural lighting. What they rejected was the sufficiency of those explanations. That accounts for some of it, one told me, but not all of it. The proportions are still wrong. The doorways are still too tall. The furniture is still too large. There's something else going on. And in a sense, they were right. There was something else going on, just not giants. What was going on, I began to suspect, was loss. Modern construction prioritizes efficiency above almost everything else. Ceilings have dropped to 8 feet because 8 feet is the minimum that feels acceptable. And every inch above that is wasted material and wasted heating and cooling costs. Doorways have shrunk to the minimum code requirements. Windows have been sized for energy performance rather than light admission. The result is buildings that function adequately but feel compressed, ordinary, forgettable. We don't build monuments anymore. We build investments. The believers are responding to something real when they look at old photographs and feel that something has been lost. They're mourning the disappearance of architectural grandeur from everyday life. They've just misidentified what they're mourning. They think they're mourning giants. They're actually mourning a culture that believed ordinary buildings should aspire to beauty. I pushed this line of thinking further. The theory wasn't just about doorways. It was about the experience of living in spaces you didn't design, built by processes you don't understand, for reasons you were never consulted about. Most people today have no connection to the construction of their built environment. They move into apartments and houses that existed before they arrived and will exist after they leave. They work in office buildings designed by architects they'll never meet, owned by corporations whose names they might not know. The spaces they inhabit were optimized for efficiency, for profit, for return on investment, not for the people who would actually live in them. The Tartarian theory expresses this alienation in narrative form. I don't recognize this world. It must not have been built for people like me. In a sense, the believers are right. The buildings weren't built for them. The buildings were built for landlords and developers and municipal bond ratings. The believers just got the explanation wrong. And that's when I started to see the shape of something larger. Tartarian theory is not really about giants. It's about the experience of living in a disenchanted world. A world where experts explain everything, where mystery has been banished, where ordinary people feel disconnected from the history beneath their feet and the spaces around them. The theory re-enchants the world. It makes the built environment magical again. It gives believers secret knowledge that authorities don't want them to have. I tested this hypothesis against each piece of evidence I had gathered. The photographs feel like proof because believers need them to be proof. They need physical evidence that the world is more mysterious than they've been told, that the smooth explanations of official history conceal something stranger and more interesting. The institutional distrust makes sense because trust has been broken elsewhere. When institutions lie about some things, believing they lie about everything becomes emotionally coherent, even if logically flawed. The digital spread works because algorithms reward engagement, and nothing engages like the feeling of uncovering hidden truth. The recommendation engine doesn't distinguish between legitimate investigation and elaborate fantasy. It only measures whether you keep watching. The debunking fails because the theory meets emotional needs that facts cannot address. You can prove the photographs are fake. You cannot prove that the world is as meaningful as believers need it to be. The architectural reality feels insufficient because technical explanations strip wonder from magnificent spaces. Learning that tall ceilings managed heat is less satisfying than believing they accommodated giants. Each cluster of evidence pointed in the same direction. The theory wasn't spreading despite being false. It was spreading because it was useful, psychologically, socially, spiritually useful, in ways that accurate information about thermal dynamics could never be. The appeal of hidden knowledge is ancient. Gnostic traditions, mystery cults, secret societies. The satisfaction of knowing what others don't. In a world where information is everywhere and expertise is hyper-specialized, most people feel excluded from real understanding. They can access Wikipedia, but they can't truly comprehend quantum mechanics or climate modeling or the financial instruments that shape their economic lives. Claiming hidden knowledge, knowledge that experts actively suppress, reclaims a sense of personal significance. It transforms the believer from someone excluded from expertise into someone who sees what the experts refuse to acknowledge. The believers describe their experience as waking up. The language isn't accidental. It frames them as enlightened and skeptics as asleep. It creates in-group and out-group. It gives ordinary research, measuring doorways, collecting photographs, arguing in comment sections, the feeling of spiritual transformation. You're not just learning alternative history. You're becoming someone who perceives reality more clearly than the masses who remain asleep. I recognize this pattern too. The language of awakening appears in countless movements, from religious conversion to political radicalization to multi-level marketing. It works because it flatters the convert's intelligence and validates the effort they've invested. Once you've woken up, going back to sleep isn't just an intellectual adjustment. It's a betrayal of your own transformation. But I had to be honest with myself. My hypothesis, that Tartarian theory expresses alienation and offers re-enchantment, was itself a satisfying pattern. It explained the evidence. It provided a framework for understanding. It made me feel like I had penetrated to the real meaning beneath the surface phenomenon. How different was my meta-investigation from the investigation it examined? I kept testing. I looked for counter-explanations that might be simpler, that might require less theoretical apparatus. The first counter-explanation was mass delusion. Maybe believers are simply gullible, poorly educated, or suffering from some shared psychological vulnerability. This would be comforting. It would locate the problem in individual deficits, rather than in anything structural about the culture. But it didn't hold up. I had interviewed believers with advanced degrees, with technical careers, with sophisticated argumentative abilities. They weren't stupid. They weren't uneducated. They had applied critical thinking skills to the wrong target, but the skills themselves were evident. Mass delusion might explain a handful of believers, but it couldn't explain the tens of thousands who had built elaborate research methodologies around the theory. The second counter-explanation was entertainment. Maybe believers don't really believe. They're performing belief as a form of play, engaging with the theory as an elaborate, alternate reality game where the fiction is part of the fun. Some believers fit this description. I encountered accounts that seemed more interested in the aesthetic of conspiracy than in the truth claims. They posted memes. They used ironic language. They treated Tartaria as a creative exercise rather than a historical argument. But many believers were clearly sincere. They had staked relationships on the theory, alienated family members who thought they were crazy, ended friendships with people who refused to see the evidence. They weren't playing. They weren't performing. They genuinely believed that mainstream history was concealing the existence of a giant civilization, and they were willing to pay social costs for that belief. Neither counter-explanation was sufficient. Believers weren't deluded, and they weren't pretending. They were meeting real needs through a framework that happened to be false. And I had to admit that my own hypothesis might be too neat. Maybe the theory spreads for different reasons in different people. Maybe some believers are alienated from the built environment, while others are seeking community, while others are processing institutional betrayal. Maybe the unifying explanation I was constructing was itself a form of pattern completion. My brain's attempt to make sense of a phenomenon that might be more complicated than any single framework could capture. The more I investigated, the less certain I became about my own conclusions. What I could say with confidence was this: the theory wasn't going away. The communities continued to grow. New believers arrived daily, drawn by the algorithms, retained by the social rewards, reinforced by the unfalsifiable structure of the theory itself. Every week brought new evidence, another photograph, another measurement, another building that didn't fit modern proportions. The believers refined their arguments. They developed increasingly sophisticated responses to criticism. They built archives and timelines and collaborative research projects. And children were being raised in households where Tartarian history was taught as suppressed truth. I found homeschool curricula that incorporated the theory. I found family YouTube channels where parents walked their children through evidence of the cover-up. A generation was growing up with a framework that treated official history as lies and giant civilization as documented fact. Whatever cultural conditions created this moment, the algorithmic amplification, the institutional distrust, the loss of architectural grandeur, the spiritual need for re-enchantment, those conditions hadn't changed. If anything, they were intensifying. The factors that made Tartarian theory possible were making countless other alternative histories possible too. The theory was a symptom, not a cause. And I didn't know what to do with that realization. If the need the theory meets is real, what healthier ways might address it? How do you give people a sense of mystery without feeding them fabrications? How do you restore connection to the built environment without rebuilding a century of architecture? If institutional trust is broken, how could it possibly be rebuilt? Not through pronouncements, not through corrections. The believers had heard the corrections. They had incorporated the corrections into evidence of the conspiracy. Trust, once lost, doesn't return on request. If debunking doesn't work, what does? I had traced the photographs to their origins. I had explained the thermal dynamics of tall ceilings. I had documented the algorithmic amplification and the community dynamics and the psychology of belief perseverance. None of it would convince a committed believer. None of it addressed the underlying needs that made the theory attractive. If people need enchantment, and I was increasingly convinced they did, where should they find it? The believers weren't wrong to want a world that felt meaningful, that contained mysteries, that exceeded the explanations of experts. They were wrong about the specific mystery they had chosen. But the desire for mystery itself wasn't a flaw. It was human. I kept returning to the photograph that started everything, the White City, the Court of Honor. Those impossible doorways, those soaring facades, that confident display of human ambition. The buildings were temporary. They were designed to be demolished. Staff and wood and plaster, dressed to look like marble, built for a single summer of display. They were never meant to last. The architects knew they would come down. The workers who built them knew the work would be erased. And yet they built magnificence anyway. They built grandeur that existed for a season and then vanished, leaving only photographs and memories and the foundations of a few permanent structures that the fair inspired. Nothing was covered up. Nothing was erased by conspiracy. The buildings simply ended, as all buildings eventually end, as all human works eventually end. The documentation is complete. The history is known. The photographs show exactly what was there. But looking at them now, those halls that dwarfed the crowds, those doorways scaled for awe, those facades that announced a civilization's confidence in itself, I understood finally why someone might need to believe they were built by beings greater than us. Because the alternative is harder to accept. The alternative is that humans built the White City. Humans designed those proportions. Humans chose to create grandeur rather than efficiency, to build monuments rather than investments, to construct beauty that they knew would be temporary, because the construction itself mattered. The aspiration itself mattered. The reaching towards something magnificent mattered, even if the reaching would fail. We built that. And then we stopped. We stopped building soaring ceilings, because air conditioning made them unnecessary. We stopped building grand doorways because energy efficiency made them wasteful. We stopped building monuments because return on investment made them impractical. We optimized our built environment for efficiency and economy. And in doing so, we created spaces that feel adequate, but not inspiring, functional, but not meaningful, human-scaled in the narrowest possible sense. The Tartarian believers looked at the old photographs and asked, "Who built this?" The answer they found was giants. The answer I found was us, a previous version of us that valued different things, that built different buildings, that had different relationships to space and grandeur and permanence. Both answers are uncomfortable in their own way. The believer's answer requires a conspiracy of global proportions, institutional suppression across centuries, the erasure of an entire civilization from human memory. It requires believing that the world is full of deliberate lies, that official history is propaganda, that the buildings around us are monuments to a forgotten race. My answer requires accepting that we chose this, that the compression of our spaces was a decision, not an imposition, that we traded grandeur for efficiency, monuments for investments, meaning for metrics, that the disenchantment believers feel when they walk through modern buildings is a reflection of choices we made collectively, through markets and regulations and cultural shifts that no one planned but everyone participated in. The believer's answer offers villains, the institutions that suppress truth, the experts who maintain lies, the shadowy forces that erase the giants from history. My answer offers no villains, only consequences. The believer's answer offers hidden meaning waiting to be discovered. My answer offers only the meanings we create ourselves, in buildings that will be adequate until they're demolished, to make way for something equally adequate. Which story would you rather believe? I don't know how to end this investigation, because investigations end with conclusions, and I don't have conclusions. I have observations that accumulated until they formed a pattern. And I have a hypothesis about what that pattern means. And I have the persistent, uncomfortable feeling that my hypothesis might itself be a kind of story I'm telling myself to make the phenomenon comprehensible. The believers are still out there. They're still measuring doorways. They're still collecting photographs. They're still building communities around shared conviction that the world is more mysterious than the authorities admit. And in a narrow sense, they're right. The world is more mysterious than any official account can capture. The buildings we inherit are stranger than we usually notice. The history we're taught is incomplete in ways we rarely examine. They've just chosen the wrong mystery. Or maybe, and this is the thought that keeps me up at night, maybe I've chosen the wrong mystery too. Maybe my investigation of the believers is itself a form of the same seeking, the same need to find pattern and meaning in a confusing world. I gathered evidence. I found hidden connections. I proposed a hypothesis that mainstream explanations missed. I built a narrative that feels satisfying. How different am I from the people I've been studying? The question lingers. It doesn't resolve. What does it mean when thousands of people prefer an elaborate fiction to a documented reality? What have we lost that makes giants feel necessary? If the need for hidden meaning is human, and I believe it is, who decides which hidden meanings are acceptable and which are dangerous delusions? I look at the photograph of the White City one more time. The manufacturer's building, the largest roofed structure ever built at that time, covering 44 acres under a single span. The doorways that could have admitted elephants. The crowds flowing through like water through a canyon. The building stood for 6 months. Then, it burned in a fire that many Chicagoans watched from their windows, the flames visible for miles. What the fire didn't destroy, the wrecking crews demolished. By 1895, almost nothing remained. We built that. We burned that. We built something smaller in its place. And somewhere right now, someone is looking at a photograph of what we built and concluding that we couldn't have built it, that it must have been giants, that the truth has been hidden. I understand why they believe it. I'm not sure that understanding helps. The investigation changed how I move through buildings. I notice doorways now. I notice ceiling heights. I notice the proportions of spaces in ways I never did before, cataloging the differences between old and new, between designed for grandeur and designed for efficiency. I walk through my suburban house and feel the compression that I used to take for granted. I walk through the county courthouse and feel the aspiration that the architects embedded in the stone. I'm not becoming a believer. I don't think giants built the Columbian Exposition. I don't think the Smithsonian is suppressing skeleton evidence. I don't think a global civilization was erased from history in the 19th century. But I understand the appeal of believing those things, in a way I didn't before I started this investigation. The theory offers something that accurate information doesn't. It offers a world that's more interesting than the world we've documented. It offers villains to blame for the disenchantment we feel. It offers community with others who see what we see. It offers the satisfaction of hidden knowledge in an age when all knowledge feels either inaccessible or trivial. The believers aren't crazy. They're not stupid. They're responding to real conditions with an explanation that happens to be false. And I don't know what would have to change for the theory to stop being appealing, because the conditions that make it appealing show no signs of changing. We will continue to build efficient buildings. Algorithms will continue to amplify engaging content, regardless of its accuracy. Institutions will continue to earn distrust through failures both historical and ongoing. People will continue to seek meaning in a world that offers information instead. And someone will continue to look at old photographs of grand buildings and conclude that we couldn't have built them, that we've fallen from something greater, that the truth is being hidden. The theory will outlast my investigation of it. I ended where I began, with the photographs of buildings that no longer exist. The White City is gone. The believers say it was destroyed to hide the evidence of giants. The historians say it was demolished because it was designed to be temporary. I've spent months trying to understand why the first explanation appeals to thousands of people more than the second. What I found is that the first explanation, however wrong, addresses something the second explanation ignores. The believers want the buildings to have been built by someone greater. They want the grandeur to reflect a greater civilization, a lost race, a hidden history that explains why we no longer build like that. The truth is harder. We built like that because we chose to. We stopped building like that because we chose to stop. No giants, no conspiracy, just choices made collectively over decades that optimized for efficiency and economy and left grandeur behind. The believers looked at the loss and saw theft. I looked at the loss and saw consequences. I don't know which vision is more disturbing.